Good morning and welcome to the Avenue Uniting Church in Australia, in Blackburn, Victoria, meeting on the lands of the Wurundjeri people. My name's Rod Peppiatt and I'm the minister in the congregation here. This morning my theme is based on a reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 6, where the shared lectionary of the church takes us over the next few weeks into the theme of and the image of Jesus as the bread of life. So reading from John chapter 6 verses 35 and then 41 on. And just a couple of quick notes here that when John's Gospel uses the words or the phrase, the Jews, he doesn't mean all Jews. He's talking about the religious leaders in particular. That's really important. And the second thing is that by the time of John's Gospel, the sense in a way of the early church and how they understood Jesus had really begun to shift from the earlier idea of Jesus really pointing beyond himself to the divine, to Jesus beginning to be worshipped himself, despite the fact that in the earlier Gospels and so forth, he seemed to reject that fairly strongly. So those are just two pieces of context. John 6:35. Jesus said to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." Then the Jews began to complain about him because he said, "I am the bread that came down from heaven." And they were saying, "Is not this Jesus, the son of Joseph, whose father and mother we know? How can he say, 'I have come down from heaven'?" Jesus answered them, "Do not complain among yourselves. No one can come to me unless drawn by the Father who sent me, and I will raise that person up on the last day. It is written in the prophets, and they shall all be taught by God. So everyone who has heard and learned from the Father comes to me. Not that anyone has seen the Father except the one who is from God. He has seen the Father. Very truly, I tell you, whoever believes has eternal life. I am the bread of life." As I said, remember that in John's Gospel, that notion of Jesus being one with God is much stronger than it was earlier. But my focus particularly is on those six very powerful words. I am the bread of life. First, a question, or two even. What is food all about? What does it do? I used to think that I knew the answer to those questions, but it turns out I was a bit naive. I thought food is about the nourishment that our body needs in order to have life and energy. And what food does, I further assumed, is to fill our hunger and fill our bellies. And certainly I knew that as the youngest of 5 brothers, I learned to eat fast at the family table, because if I paused to take a breath, there was a danger of one of them finishing my meal for me, thinking that I'd finished. It turns out, though, that I was naive. I know this now because I've watched MasterChef, all 16 series, I think. Yes, that's right. I've learned what food is and what food does through listening to the stories of the contestants and the comments of the judges. I've learned that food reminds us. It tells stories. Well, I had a sense of that one, to be honest, through our understandings of the bread and the wine of Holy Communion. But apparently food also transports us. I didn't know that. And what's more, food can be sensuous, comforting, playful, fun, and even sexy. Who knew? "I am the bread of life," said Jesus, according to the storyteller we know as John. One of the MasterChef judges, Po Ling Yao, says that food can transport her in a very sensory way to special places and times in her life. It gets her in touch with her Malaysian heritage and culture and her family. And it also tells for her something of her story of both inclusion and exclusion in the Australian community as a migrant. The sort of thing of wishing she had Vegemite sandwiches to take in her school lunchbox instead of, a Malaysian curry. And a past judge, the late Jock Zonfrillo, he told his story of how food put him in touch with his Scottish and Italian heritage. And he also talked then, at that time, of how his passion for food and cooking saved him from a lethal drug habit. Now, these things are more than simply memory. MasterChef is telling us stories with real and raw and powerful emotions in judges and contestants as food is dreamed about, presented, described, named, smelled, and finally tasted. We see dishes that move people to tears just with how they look. Dishes that tell their own story of triumph and achievement or of falling short. All rather a long way from my need to eat fast and defend my plate from my vulture siblings. I am the bread of life, says Jesus in John's Gospel. Now, I confess that I've been a bit dismissive of some of the stuff of MasterChef over the years as perhaps a bit pretentious. And some of the backstories seem a bit overdone, a bit amped up for TV. And sometimes that's true. But at the same time, I've also come to see something of the truth in these ideas about food. And as I think about the rich symbolism in John's Gospel with the bread of life, that may seem an odd link, but I hope you'll stick with me for a moment. Because I sense that the understandings about food have something in common with the way that John and his community understands Jesus as the bread of life. It's been interesting to watch in recent years how the cultural makeup of MasterChef contestants began to be a better representation of the diversity in Australian society than it was in the early years. And we've had Australians in the last few years whose heritage included Indigenous, Sri Lankan, Bengali or Bangladeshi Melbourne, Italian, Hong Kong, French, Venezuela, Vietnam, Greek and Anglo-Australian, just to name a few. And it's been good to watch more and more contestants becoming confident to present dishes that represent their cultural heritage and their stories, rather than trying to recreate food that they thought the judges wanted to taste. We saw how they were able to infuse their cooking with new and unfamiliar ingredients and challenge their own creative instincts. We saw on a number of occasions how contestants were influenced by where they were cooking, whether at a Yarra Valley vineyard or a Melbourne city restaurant or a rooftop in Hong Kong. I was particularly struck by this on an episode filmed a few years ago now in the Western Macdonnell Ranges in Central Australia near Alice Springs. It's a place I loved visiting. And on this particular show, local elders had welcomed the show in a smoking ceremony, and then the cook started. And one contestant born in Melbourne of Bangladeshi heritage was visibly and profoundly moved by the setting and by the local ingredients with which she had to cook. And the food she brought together fused in a way the Bengali food of her family with the native berries and the fruits that surrounded her in that moment. Familiar and new flavours seemed to come together in a moment of creativity and careful exploration. with her Indigenous host, she asked, "How might these things work together? How do you prepare these berries?" After one experiment, "Oh, yuck!" But after another, "Hey, these go well." It became for her an incredible experience of claiming her whole identity, her Bangladeshiness, if you like, I know that's clumsy, and her Australianness. It was also good to see the judges being influenced by the contestants. Years ago, one of the judges upset a lot of people on and off the show by suggesting that a certain Asian dish wasn't really fine dining. Not this year. It turns out that a well-made curry can be fine dining, just as much as a classic steak with a red wine jus with parsnip puree and 3 asparagus stalks and a carrot. There was a learning. "I am the bread of life," said Jesus. Remember how our ancestors ate manna in the wilderness? God provided for their needs. "Whoever comes to me will not be hungry." The new covenant between the people and their God that John sees in Jesus is firmly grounded in all that has gone before in the life of his people. In the gospel, the religious leaders began to complain about Jesus because he claimed to be the bread of heaven. He didn't fit their view of one from God. He challenged them to be open to new things, to see God at work in new ways, not limited by their views of what was sacred and what wasn't. And the image of Jesus as bread in John becomes an invitation to new and deeper imagination, to sense holiness in the sharing of food and hospitality, rather than simply in a legalist austerity. It's no accident that in all of the Gospels, shared food, especially bread, provides a setting for some of the most profound stories of Jesus and his ministry. And for John, I suggest that this too carries an invitation. The invitation to let our eating be more than simply going through the motions. When we eat together with others, be it family, friends, or whomever, it's an opportunity, an invitation to enjoy the food, the time, and the company. I'm trying to make myself slow down when I eat, to take smaller mouthfuls, to savour what I'm eating, rather than simply saying grace and hoeing into it, as an attitude of expressing my gratitude for having enough to eat. That's also become true when I eat by myself or I cook for myself. I know that cooking for one isn't always easy, and many of you know that more than I do. But I've found on occasion that there is a real sense of blessing in slowly and carefully eating something I've prepared to eat by myself. Perhaps a new recipe that I knew Catherine wouldn't like. Just as it is in the food, the physical element of food, I think there's an invitation in this symbol, this rich image, this bread of life image, to sit with the stories of Jesus and his way, to be nourished in them for our life and faith each day, to enjoy their depth of flavour rather than chewing fast and missing something. And perhaps the invitation is also to sit with the symbolism of enough in a world constantly telling us we don't have enough, and to be honest, where many people don't have enough. Maybe our best response to that is to pay attention to what we do have. After all, that was the message of the manna bread in the desert, wasn't it? Jesus' listeners and John's readers knew the context for that one. It's a bit trickier in the world of Macca's and the Colonel Sanders. As with the other I am statements in John's Gospel, the storyteller we know as John bears witness to the identity and the purpose of Jesus. I am the bread of life. It's a deeply invitational symbol. Eating the bread means much more than simply being able to identify it on the plate. It invites readers then and now into the sacred mystery of God in the world, glimpsed in the way of Jesus. It invites us to take up that way, the way of love, as our calling and as our food for the journey. It turns out that food actually does quite a lot when we pay attention to it. Blessings.